Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm stalling for the cookie eaters to find their way to us. And I'm assuming that because the other equipment, as I've been told, is being used for the presentation this morning, that I should probably speak in this not only so that people here can hear, but so that you pick it up for the recording. Is that correct?
That can pick you up anywhere in the room too.
Oh, you can?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Just a couple of beginning comments. Number one, I've noticed in walking around this morning that you're theologically correct, because I'm very happy to see that the wise men are off in a corner somewhere on a table waiting for the cue to come on December 6th. Because all over town they're stuffed into the manger already. And I'm always happy to see when people appreciate the fact that the wise men were a different crew. For that matter, this topic this morning, why? Why talk about 4 American Christian groups in the middle of December, in the middle of Advent? Does it have to do with anything special? You don't really know where I'm coming from in this presentation, so it might be difficult to guess. But there are some American Christian groups which don't believe in celebrating Christmas. So that would be a good one to talk about. In the midst of December, when on TV they're encouraging us to get booster shots and flu shots, there are some Christian groups which don't believe in vaccinations. So that might be a good group to talk about. American, as both of them are, unusual. And there might be some other reasons we'll gather as we work our way through. But it wasn't ultimately a choice on the part of your staff here who said, this is the topic we think you should talk about. That was the reason. Let's see if I can figure out where we are on this. Whoops, went too far too fast. So we're going to talk about American Christianity, and I suppose that means something unique to me, because at one time I was a student in Germany, and people would talk about American Christians, and they would hear about, at one time I remember looking out the window from the complex that I was staying in Göttingen, and there were 2 young men in nice white shirts walking up to a house across the street, and I said, aha, Mormons. But later on, as they were gone, I walked up to the woman and said to her, so, could I ask you a question? Were those young men who came to your door this morning possibly Mormon? Yes, she said. And I said, well, what kind of things did they ask you? She said, well, they got out a record, and they said that was in the days of LPs. And they showed me a record and said, have you ever heard of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir? She said, no. And so I don't know how they played such a thing, but they gave her a copy of it. And so there they were all over the world. And people in Germany and people around the world often ask questions about some of these strange groups, because you have a Christianity that's often directed from top on down by the government, controlled by officials, and therefore you only have certain expressions of Christianity in certain parts of the world. But here in the United States, where we sort of sprang up like Topsy, we've got all kinds of expressions, and people around the world are bewildered to look at Americans and say, whoa, what is all that that you have in storefronts downtown in Chicago? A lot of those are tax write-offs, because somebody can say, well, this is a church and I live upstairs, but nevertheless this building is something that I don't have to pay tax on because it's a church. And you just go down one storefront church after another. So it's amazing when you look at the numbers. I've seen numbers that don't make any sense, to be like 30,000 different kinds of churches in the United States. Why? Some of that has to do with who we are as Americans, and some of us have to do with who we are as human beings. So So even in China, for example, where Christianity is allowed officially, there are some other groups that have sprung up because what? There's confusion, they're exposed to different ideas, people like to debate, they travel and they discover things they never heard of before, they're curious, they're open to challenges, they get insights, they talk with one another and they come up with a new idea, they're bored, they're reading stuff, they study things. I like to say that if people wear different pairs of glasses, and if I took the glasses off the table here and put mine on, those are 2.5 power. And if I took somebody else's off here, they might be anybody higher power, from a higher power.
He's looking at me.
He might be wearing contacts. But we see things differently because of the different glasses that we wear. And that's pretty true of us as human beings, how we look at reality. We see things differently. And so as religious people, we begin to see things quite differently as we go around the world. Looking at the Mediterranean Sea, that white section in the middle there, surrounded by a lot of blues and some dark blues, and you can see Spain on the one hand, and then France, and then Italy and Switzerland, the Alps, and Greece and Macedonia, and Syria and Turkey. Well, Turkey comes first, Anatolia, and then comes Syria, and then comes Palestine, then comes Egypt, then Libya, then what is today Morocco, and the dark spots, the heavy concentrations of Christianity. You can imagine that as Christians began to spread throughout the Mediterranean world, without transportation, apart from the boats, the ships on the Mediterranean Sea, and apart from without any kind of communication, who knows what kind of ideas and perspectives they began to develop. I probably should have made that larger, but if I were to go closer to it, here you see Carthage, there you see Alexandria, here you see Antioch, there you see Rome, here you see Lyon, there you see Trier, and so those were concentrations of Christianity, and they began to differ because this part of the Mediterranean area spoke Latin, that part spoke Greek. And the language can often be a way of thinking differently because in the cultural world of the Greeks and the cultural worlds of Romans, different kinds of things began to happen. And so as Christianity spread through Europe and now across the Atlantic to the United States, you can imagine lots of different kinds of changes took place, as well as the East spread all the way through Assyria to India and China and Japan. There isn't much that's left in Japan and China from the early Christian arrivals there, but there are some interesting archaeological artifacts. So splits began to take place, and you'd be surprised at the strength of some of them. The Oriental Orthodox are pretty much forgotten by us, and I'm saying all of this by way of background to talking about the 4 churches in the United States. Oriental Orthodox, 60 million people you've probably never heard of. They are the Copts in Egypt, they are the Ethiopians, they are the Thomas Christians of India, they are the Syrian. No, that's really Syrians, right? So 60 million of them, and for the most part, because a lot of immigration never took place from those countries to the United States historically, we don't see their churches. Here in Milwaukee area, we do see a big one on 4394 going out, the Coptic Orthodox Church on Drexel. Amazing kind of an edifice. Eastern Orthodox and Western Church split in 1054. So look at how big the Eastern Orthodox is worldwide, 220 million. Admittedly, all these numbers are a little bit flexible depending on you know, whether they're counting an active or a passive Christian. And the Western Church, we largely say Roman Catholic for that. The largest of them all, 1.3 billion. And from the Western Church, by and large, through Europe, we come to the United States. The Reformation branches such as Lutheran, Calvinistic, Anglican, and branches from them. And then the uniquely American denominations, the 4 secret ones I haven't told you the names of yet. 59 million. And here we are, Lutherans in the United States, maybe 5 to 7 million. But 59 million, kind of surprising. A couple definitions as we move into a discussion of these, because historically we've often said, oh, those are cults. Well, let's try to use some definitions that are a little bit more objective and not so pejorative. First of all, a church in the New Testament, ecclesia, if you take it apart linguistically, it's ek kaleo, to call out. And so it's a group of people who are called out from the others. It's not talking about a building, it's talking about a community. The community of Ephesus, for example, the church which is in Ephesus. A denomination is a word that we use very much in the United States. How many denominations are there? Well, you could say, all right, this is a denomination, but that is a cult. But then all of a sudden the cult becomes 2 million people, and you say, wow. And they say, we should not be called a cult anymore. We are a denomination. And when I'm 20 million, then I'm surely a denomination. So those are words that you play with. A sect is generally a subgroup of a denomination. So a cult, to use a less pejorative term, is something which is really dominated by a historical person. And that's not negative, it's just how it is. So in Christian Science, for example, you have Mary Baker Eddy, the name which is associated with Christian Science. And so at one point, Christians, that's mainline Christians, used to say, well, that's a cult. But today, it's right across the street from us over here, and they're our neighbors, and maybe we don't want to use the word pejoratively, so we say that's a church, not a cult. All I'm saying is that we play with definitions and it's not easy to decide. It may not be so easy to see all these, so I'm going to talk about it, but I think it's good to see the branches that have come from the Reformation. So the largest groups that have sprung from the Reformations, Anglican up here, Lutheran, Reformed, the 3 large groups, and then from each of those, from the Anglican in America, we call them Episcopal because of the system of government, the bishops. And from the Anglican Church in England came John and Charles Wesley, the Methodists, and from the Methodists came the Holiness churches and the Pentecostal churches, and also the Salvation Army, interestingly enough, came out of the Methodist Church. There was another kind of Reformation called the Radical Reformation, which we have coming down here, the Anabaptists. We are breaking them down into Mennonites and Amish and Hutterites, came from the Czech Republic. These were German and settled in the United States, often in communal groups. The Lutheran group, interestingly, didn't provide a lot of offshoots as did some of these others. From the Reformed, you get in Scotland the Presbyterian, then in Texas the Restoration churches, as the Texans would say, where we came from, Church of Christ. That's one of them, and then the Christian church, both of them are from that part of the country. And then also the Congregationalist, that comes from the Puritan tradition and merged more recently with the Evangelical and Reformed, or EUB, and so you get the United Church of Christ. A lot of people think Unitarian Universalists, the UU people, are American, but that really grew up in Switzerland, and then Hungary has more Unitarians than the United States, 500,000. And Baptist, which is the largest Protestant group in the United States, came out of that movement, largely focusing on the rule of the local congregation is why it breaks off from congregation. So it's just interesting to see those, because we're not talking about those today. Those are the ones we're not talking about. Now there's two things you need to know about as we move into the ones we're going to talk about, and those are the two movements in the United States which created churches that wouldn't exist were not for these two movements, the Great Awakenings we call them. Some would count 4 Great Awakenings, but there were 2 which created the churches that we know as American offsprings. The first one, 1735 to 1755. I like that picture because already in that time, before the Revolutionary War, there were established cities on the East Coast with buildings that were looking almost like their counterparts in England, for example. But with the First Great Awakening, everything was kind of shaken up and they were wobbling around, and the things weren't so sturdy anymore because they were beginning to think about radical things. This began in England with George Whitefield, along with John and Charles Wesley, the 3 of them working together. John and Charles never left the Anglican Church, but George did. And that separated him theologically from the Wesley brothers. And he came to the United States. It's difficult for us to imagine this, but he was I'll say a country preacher who got up on a stand in a field somewhere and could speak to 5,000 people. So you remember the New Testament when Jesus did that. How in the world did he do that? Well, we say in Galilee, the Sermon on the Mount, for example, that church is the church that was built on that presumed spot, has a big hollowed out area beneath that. And they said, well, if Jesus stood on the top of this, probably the voice would have, catapulted its way through the valley and 5,000 people could have heard him. Who knows, but George Whitefield had apparently a bellowing voice that could be heard by thousands and thousands of people. And what he spoke of, and Jonathan Edwards, one of the great Puritan preachers, it was a call to change, to become, in this chaos that resulted from people flocking from the old world to the new world, they were asking questions about their religious allegiances. And in those questions, there were people who were living scandalously, and so the first awakening called people to repentance and commitment. And out of that came something quite interesting. Already in England, the Puritans and the Congregationalists and the Methodists emerged. But it was also, for us here in America, the birth of democracy. Because in that time, they denied the old authorities of Europe, no kings anymore. They denied tradition, they denied precedent. We don't need to do any of the things that were done before in the old world. We are part of a new creation. And we have freedom of choice. I just heard Anthony Fauci saying that the people in America seem to not to want to do anything they're told to do. This has to do with vaccinations. And so freedom of choice, we're free, nobody can tell us what to do. We make individual decisions and we have opportunity. All of that arose out of the First Great Awakening. Not so much yet individual church bodies, but those movements were fostered. Now, the Second Great Awakening comes roughly 40 years after the First Great Awakening. It occurs mostly in Western New York, where there were so many of these revivals that were taking place that they, after it happened, said it was a burnt out area. The revival preachers had just come through and burned the thing down, with people floundering on the floors and on the fields and crying out for God to save them. It was a miraculous moment. I didn't grow up in that tradition, maybe few of you did. My tradition was Lutheran, but I remember one time when I was somewhere at some kind of a ecumenical conference, and there was a guy sitting at the table from Canada, and there was a local Baptist minister sitting there also. And the guy in Canada was describing something that had taken place where people were all upset and excited about new possibilities and new revelations and new faith movements. And the Baptist said to him, "Was it a revival?" And I listened to that, and I didn't even know what that meant, because I thought, what is he talking about? But the people in the Second Great Awakening would have known what is a revival, because it went from town to town, just wiped them out. Hard to believe that there was such a thing, but they built these vast amphitheaters, open to the air, covered over on the top, kind of to reflect the sound somewhat, and a preacher could speak to thousands of people. What made that possible? Think of the frontier, think of space. I remember one time we were in Canada, and it was a Sunday morning, and I was up early. We were filling a vacancy at a church in Alberta, and there was a Japanese girl there, and there were all kinds of Japanese tourists. And I said, "Well, what brings you and all these Japanese tourists to Canada?" "Space," she said. So space psychologically does something. It gives you open feelings, freedom of choice, no hierarchy. This was what they stood on after the First Great Awakening. I'm not so sure these are that visible because of the blue, but these are the kind of emphases besides theological differences that came out of the Second Great Awakening. Abolition, anti-slavery, women's rights, utopian social movements, the number of communities that came as whole communities during the 1850s from Europe, where they wanted to live together and profit from one another's various incomes and put it in a pot, kind of like the very first Christians in Acts. Anti-Masonry, prohibition against alcohol, vegetarianism, surprisingly, social experiments, different ways of living together, communal societies, the Amana colonies, which we know of in Iowa, that kind of thing came from that. Ephrata in Pennsylvania. One time, because I was sort of fascinated with these communal societies, I subjected my family to vacations in those spots. And we would go and we would visit some of these communal societies, the Robert Owens one, Oneida, and I found them fascinating, but all of that arose out of the Second Great Awakening. So what are some of the theological movements that these new churches in America built on? First of all, dispensationalism. There was a guy by the name of John Darby. He founded the Plymouth Brethren in England. He was uneducated, apart from some elementary education, but a student of the Bible. And he decided that the Bible could be divided up into 7 sections, each one initiated by God and then ended by God. And in those, God did something special, and we were now in the 7th one of these sections. He called them dispensations. And the question was, when would this one end, and when would the end of the world come? So that was kind of the panic that was being engineered by this thought. Where are we now? And that was in the mood of the Second Great Awakening, the fear that it might be closer to the end than you thought. Millennialism, which does relate to that, but it's specifically related to a passage in Revelation which talks about the 1,000-year reign, highly symbolic number. But for those who took it literally, the question was, where in time, in these dispensations, we're in the 7th dispensation now, and where in that one are we? Are we in the 1,000 years now, and then Christ is going to come? Is Christ going to come, and then the 1,000 years are going to come? Those are all the crazinesses which they wrestled with, the premillennials and the postmillennials, and the amillennials. Lutherans never got involved with any of that stuff, but church bodies that did, not the 4 we're going to talk about, they did, but Baptists have often been heavily involved in millennial thinking. And then restoration theology. A large part of it in the Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma, the idea that there were two men, Campbell and Stone, who were kind of the founders of these. Sometimes they called them, the Lutherans would say, oh, the Campbellites, meaning it was a pejorative term, but they came from Campbell or Stone, and they wanted to restore the church to its origins, just as it was in the New Testament. That was the goal. And do away with all of the things that the church had sort of picked up along the way. So here they are. The four denominations that were created on American soil and could never have been created were it not for the things that took place, first of all, in the First and Second Great Awakening. The Latter-day Saints, 1830, Seventh-day Adventists, 1863, Jehovah's Witnesses, 1870, Christian Scientists, 1879. I put that flag there because I don't know what that black thing is, but the flag in the 1850s had 30 stars. There were 30 states. And that was fairly true of the Americanism in which these four groups emerged. I put Pentecostalism down here simply because people would say, okay, how come you didn't include the Pentecostal church in that? There's a lot of reasons. One is you could refer to some Pentecostal or charismatic movements already in the New Testament. Secondly, although Pentecostalism as a movement in the United States took place in Azusa Street in California in 1906, really what we think of as Pentecostal in the church today is not so much denominations as movements. So we think of Assemblies of God, for example, which is a Pentecostal movement church, largest one of all the Pentecostal movements. And yet, it's different. I could spend a lot of time arguing why that's different, but I just want to say it's different. Unitarian Universalists, some people think that that cropped up in the United States, but I already made the point that even though the merger between those two groups took place in this country, both Unitarian and Universalists came from Europe, as I've already mentioned. So now let's take a brief look at these four bodies: the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whatever title you want to give to it. It's the earliest of the four. In many ways, from the standpoint of a person who comes out of the traditional, and that itself is a question as to whether this is traditional Lutheran position, but radical and bizarre, but only possible because in the Second Great Awakening, everything was opened up. You were free to go anywhere you wanted to. You were free to think any way you wanted to, religiously. And so Joseph Smith's parents already before him regularly saw visions. It was characteristic of the people at the time. Sometimes in these Pentecostal moments, nobody would have used that word at the time, but in the Great Awakening where a revival preacher was calling these people to stand up and repent and be born again, when that was happening in a great revival setting and people were just being slain by the Spirit and falling to the ground, they saw visions. They heard voices. So did Joseph Smith. Already at 14, he began to hear these visions and voices. And he lived in Western New York. He was very concerned because of all these voices about what he grew up in, Presbyterian, and then Congregational, which he later joined. And he was sort of all over the place, and he wasn't sure what to make of it until at the age of 14 he had a visit in a vision from the angel Moroni. And the angel, I honestly don't know whether Moroni was male or female, or in transition. I think she said, in a hill in New York, there are some golden tablets, and if you go dig those up, you'll find the revelation. So at first he didn't do it, and then the angel came back a couple times, and finally he went. And he dug up these tablets, and then he got a pair of golden glasses, which allowed him to read what was written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it told the story about the people who had lived on this continent at the very same time that the biblical world was taking place. So Old and New Testament. At that time of the Old Testament, New Testament, the world that was taking place in the New World was described in what is today the Book of Mormon. So today, the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, use the Bible, but also the Book of Mormon in connection with each other. And it's a denomination in which I would say, if you've followed that for as long as I have, there is a gradual morphing into mainline Christian teaching on the part of the Mormons. And every once in a while you'll see, while no blacks were allowed in the Mormons, now by official statement from the president, the bishop, it's possible that no females were allowed to perform any kinds of rites. Now that's changed. And so gradually you see them adapting themselves to traditional mainline Christianity as a minority group within America, gradually becoming a majority group, 20 million of Mormons. Unique teachings: families, by being married in the temple through sacred rites, are sealed for all eternity. Baptism can take place in the temple on the part or for an ancestor that you once had, and you can make them Mormon, and you can make them eternally saved by being baptized for them vicariously. I discovered, because I do genealogy in my family, that one of my great-great-grandparents was made a Mormon, even though he was a Lutheran.
Bless you, brother.
That when we are born, we are not born just as newborn infants, but we had pre-existing spirits. Each Mormon, like the two I mentioned in Göttingen, now women can go out as teens, typically, two women as opposed to man and woman, as missionaries around the world. And they are premillennials, so they picked that theme up from the Second Great Awakening. 17 million people. That's rapidly increasing from the days when we first started looking at those numbers.
They didn't care for Jews that much either.
Okay.
There's a verse in the Book of Mormon that said only the Jews could kill their own God. I found that very distressing.
Seventh-day Adventists, the second group to be formed. Surprising numbers, 21 million. We could have said that's a sect, a cult. At 21 million, we now say it's a church body. Ellen White was the founder. There was a man by the name of Miller who was really the founder of this movement of the Adventists, and Ellen White was a follower of hers. So in a pejorative way, you would have said she's a Millerite in those days. They believed in progressive revelation, so sort of like Joseph Smith, you would get visions, and from these visions you would have revelations that could be shared with other people. And Ellen White had thousands of revelations during the course of her life, she claimed. Despite that, the Seventh-day Adventists have a roughly evangelical message, believing most of the traditional things that we believe as mainline Christians, with a heavy focus on Adventism, the idea that we are in this seventh dispensation and the end is about to come, and we don't know when, but the Advent, the final coming, Advent means come, that's important to know where we stand in the Advent. She was also interested, and this to me is the most fascinating piece of this, she was interested in health, a new emphasis because historically Christians have not had that much focus on good health and health practices. In recent years, yes, but not so much years ago. And so today in Battle Creek, Michigan, and Loma Linda, California, there are huge sanitariums. I don't know if sanatoria is the plural. And one half of Adventists, that's surprising to me, are vegetarian. I would have thought more would be vegetarian. You go to a hospital like Loma Linda, and only vegetarian food is served there. But who was a Seventh-day Adventist and a friend of Ellen White's but J.H. Kellogg? And he had been, as a vegetarian, asking himself, how can I get a breakfast that doesn't include meat? And he came up with his version of cornflakes. And so today, if you go to, let's say, Metro Mart, and you look down the grocery aisle of breakfast foods, as we recently had a girl from Germany do, have all these boxes and boxes and boxes in the United States. Astonishing. And we owe all of that to the Seventh-day Adventists. Because they wanted something as an alternative to ham and eggs. Or bacon, or what, sausage. The Sabbath, also very important for the Seventh-day Adventists, and nothing can take place on the Sabbath day, and for that I laud them, because the Sabbath has been destroyed by club soccer and everything under the sun that requires that your children and grandchildren go out to play games on Sundays. In those cases, it would have been Saturday. So Seventh-day Adventists, the third group, not as large, and I should point out that when I say 17 million, the great thrust of Seventh-day Adventists has been in Africa and in other countries of the world, not so much in the United States. If I were being condescending, I would say, well, yeah, that's in countries where there's not a lot of education on the part of the people who are becoming Seventh-day Adventists. It's really not fair, because there wasn't much education on the part of the first Christians either. You know, as St. Paul says, not many were wise. So Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Russell, they were again pejoratively called the Russellites by the Lutherans. Oh, those are the Russellites. He was raised a Presbyterian and a Congregationalist. He was confused also about what to do about all these denominations that were cropping up around him. He only had an elementary education, but his teachings, he was a student of the Bible, never got past elementary school. He believed in progressive revelation. He had constant visions, new ideas, constantly coming to him. He did not believe in the Trinity. He acknowledged Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but he had different arrangements and roles for them. He was politically neutral. That meant when it came to government, you didn't have to take part in the military, for example. So Seventh-day Adventists are conscientious objectors. They were post-millennial. There were no blood transfusions. I remember Mrs. Johnson, who lived next door to us when I was a child, and she was a Jehovah's Witness, and I really never understood what that was about, but my mother said that she needed a blood transfusion and she refused one, and so she died. So that little piece of information was stored in my memory bank, even though I had no clue what that meant at the time. There were no secular celebrations for Jehovah's Witnesses, and therefore no Christmas, no Easter. It's not to say they didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe that Jesus was born, but they believed those are secular celebrations that had been invented to create reasons for religious people to come together around secular goals like Christmas trees and whatever. And there's truth to that. There's also an interesting statistic that comes out of, so not only the 100,000 in Revelation, but the word, the letters, 144,000, are found in the book of Revelation, and they take that literally to mean that only 144,000 will be saved. So all the rest, if you had the number on your forehead when you were born, then you didn't have to bother if you didn't have a number, because you don't have to worry about this. But if you had the number, it was descended really from the Presbyterian idea of being of election, correct. despite all of those unique emphases, there's a rather traditional emphasis on redemption and justification that comes out of the message of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And finally, the last one to emerge, Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science. There are some interesting movements that were afoot. The Transcendentalists, we don't think of them so much in terms of American religion, but we think of them in terms of American literature. So we think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a Transcendentalist poet, and we think of James Thoreau, and we think of Whittier, and we think of Emily Dickinson. They were all immersed in transcendental thought. Transcendental thought takes a lot from Platonism, the idea that we are experiencing here something which is not real. Reality is on the other side, whatever the other side is, a spiritual realm, and we are living in something which seeks to mirror it, but we don't really have reality among ourselves, and therefore we are an image of reality, and therefore illness is not real. This is how far Mary went with it. And if illness is not real, therefore doctors are irrelevant, and medicine is irrelevant. So what we do with our understanding of our problem, whatever it is we may go to a reading room in a Christian Science church or in some kind of a storefront, and we read the literature that the person there proposes that we read, which helps us to rise above our material thoughts and enter into a spiritual realm, and in a sense cure ourselves or be cured by the spiritual reality beyond us. So while there are in Christian Science aspects of our traditional theology, they can talk about regeneration and justification and things like that, but all reinterpreted to mean something within the Christian Science perspective. Quite fascinating, but problematic, because this takes place, the latest of them all, but nevertheless early in our century. If anybody has a medical background, you realize that we're becoming more and more sophisticated in our understanding of modern medicine. And the more sophisticated we become, the more we trust it, the less we rely on the thought that this is not real, this world in which we live. You'd have to be fairly philosophical to believe that. And furthermore, when it comes to vaccinations, from this standpoint, not important, because the disease is not real. So, as with every denomination, not everybody believes everything that's taught, but many, and probably most Christian Science people don't believe it anymore, and Christian Science is diminishing faster than most denominations because of the reality of the importance of modern medicine. So, looking at these, what are some of the issues that jump out at us, confusing as they may be, when we think about these four churches? All of them seem to have some confusion about all of these denominations which in the first awakening and the second awakening were rising up. And we can know of four big ones here, but surely there are all kinds of storefront ones and minor ones that we don't even know names for. But nevertheless, they were surrounded by new immersions of religious thought. And that was confusing for all four of these. And all four of them fit the definition of a cult in a positive way, because they are led by a person's thinking. None of them had any formal education. Peter didn't either, but it's just kind of a modern condescending thought. Three, they were very influenced by the dispensational thought and the millennial thought of the time. I like to say that they majored in minors. that when you take a look at what's the big emphasis of Seventh-day Adventists, or the big emphasis of Christian Science, those tend to be minor issues within the Christian spectrum. And that's just interesting to me. And the 5, boy, were they Bible students. I mean, they would put us to shame in terms of the time they spent analyzing the scripture and what could it mean. And they came up with ideas about nobody had even thought of before them. So they were unique in their views. And then they had, number 6, a commitment to personal outreach, which of course puts us to shame as well. Because how in the world did something as bizarre as Mormonism, for example, grow to have 20 million adherents around the world? And Seventh-day Adventists likewise. Christian Science, maybe 500,000 at its height, but they say 300,000 today. That's quite amazing, as they would go door to door and feel free. This is a funny personal story, but I'll tell it. My father would be embarrassed. But my father used to say, I never had a problem with these people who come to the door to try to convert you to whatever their religion is. So one time I just happened to observe this. I have no idea how old I was, but he invited these people to come in. There were 2 of them. They came in the living room and they sat down and they began to talk about whatever their faith was. And then my father said, all right, that's enough, now you can go. And he said, see, I never have any problem. He would tell other people this, not me. But that was his way of saying, I don't debate them, I just tell them to get out. Well, but nevertheless, you have to appreciate the fact that they came door to door. And if you take 2 famous people, who I find it hard to put into that category, Prince, for example, the singer, and his name's going out of my head, the famous singer, dancer, black guy, dead. Michael Jordan?
Jackson.
Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson. They were both door-to-door evangelists within Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses.
And may I ask, does Unitarianism, which is so much a part of so many people we know, does that come out of Christian Science?
Oh, out of Christian Science. Good. No, so Unitarianism really begins in Switzerland when, and I'm sure that there were people long before that who had that kind of non-Trinitarian thinking, but begins in Switzerland with people who objected to what John Calvin was preaching and said they didn't believe in the Trinity, and Michael Servetus was the leader of that group. And so he was, by Calvin's order, burned at the stake. The first Unitarian. And from Switzerland, it moved to Hungary, where today it's thriving, and then to the United States. So there was no Christian Science involved.
The parking lot is full, and it keeps growing on North Avenue, so.
Oh.
Of the Unitarian Church.
Oh. Okay. They're not going to the vegetable market next to it.
No. So there's a very large African American church called the Church of God in Christ, which is Pentecostal, and it's interesting to me. On PBS in the last few years, Henry Louis Gates Jr. did a thing on the Black Church.
Okay, yeah.
And some of the similar currents that you explain here as being currents that moved the white church historically in the United States also play out in the African American community. And it's interesting to me that might be an additional church that could only have come to be in the United States.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult one because of the Pentecostal roots. So,
Sure.
United States Pentecostal roots are 1906 in Azusa, and that was a black community which was having the Pentecostal experience. And then, as they tended to spread their experience, the black and the white separated. And I'm saying that was probably a racism thing more than it was some theological awareness, and as a result, white Pentecostals moved in different directions. But the question as to whether that's an American church, the Pentecostal church, quote unquote, there is such a thing as the Pentecostal church. But most of the Pentecostal movements are found in other denominations like Assemblies of God and have other kinds of names, maybe like the one that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just not so easy to categorize.
Sure.
So just continue our discussion with that. I think as we morph toward, some of these four churches morph toward traditional Christian perspectives, Mormons being the most obvious one to me, what are some of the things that they're dropping and some of the things which they're doing? And traditional theology, including emphasis on health, we're picking up a lot of emphasis on good health and good living, and we're taking that largely from some of these groups that we initially condescended to. I think that's a positive. So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses in these four American churches, and some of the strengths and weaknesses in our own traditional or in our own Lutheran perspective?
Is it the Seventh-day Adventists who believe in, I think, that preparation, that they have storehouses of food and,
The Mormons.
it's the Mormons, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
That believe in preparedness.
Preparedness for the future in the event that we would all be starving and you would have enough in your basement to get by on, whereas others would not.
Does that go back to the Mormons refusing any sort of government welfare? They are obligated to take care of their own. That was a big deal, I know, at least 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, theologically, I think that was their expectation, that we take care of our own. We aren't ever going to be in a situation to be dependent.
I believe that's Amish.
Well, what we're
They don't
talking about is
follow.
Mormon. Now, Amish
Yeah.
might do that also. But
Yeah, they're not
Don't wanna
qualified.
be dependent.
They don't need to apply for Social Security because the government believes that they take care of their own families all the way from birth to death. Do you think some of the movements started by people with despair? And I say that because I'm thinking of like Jim Jones and this character that all these people committed suicide because they wanted to take the comet to heaven and all of this. Some of the movements I think started because people were kind of hopeless, and all of a sudden someone is preaching hope and it gets to them.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Jim Jones, I mean, that's clearly a cult thing in terms of definition. Saying it positively, it was a religious movement initiated by an individual, by a man, and whether he was, I never tried to analyze what his motives were, his own motives in doing that. He probably believed that, but despair, what he was running from, what he was running toward, those are interesting questions to ask in all of these leaders.
For me, that one of the confusing things is the word church. And as a Lutheran, I grew up that there's only one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, period. And consequently, like a Balboa tree, there's all of these expressions that come out of the ground that I can embrace if Christ is in the midst of it. So I learned that the word church is you are in the middle of the word C-H-I-E-Chen. Wherever you're surrounded by Christ, there's the church. And that's very liberating.
Yeah.
To go to other expressions and not feel like an outsider, because it's not about us, it's about Christ. And I can hear that when I go to churches or I don't hear it. Today I'm hearing a lot more, it's all about us.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting analogy. My eyeglass analogy may not be as sharp as that one, but one of the things I like about it is that it allows me, by putting on different glasses, the same person can see different things with different glasses. And sometimes those are meaningful and sometimes they're not.
I've often been, have a high regard for the rigor of a lot of the churches that you've spoken about, how rigorous they are about their faith, and I would contrast that sometimes with us being theologically flabby or lazy. That's one thing, and then another analogy that is helpful to me is, if the truth is like a sphere, each of us can only ever see half the truth. But because you stand at a different place to look at that sphere, you can see a part of the truth that I cannot see, and I can see a part of the truth that you cannot see. And so the unity of, I'm often moved when I go to different denominations or different churches that I wasn't raised in, that there is a particular emphasis of the Spirit that is a new revelation to me, and it's life-giving rather than life-taking away, as opposed to being encouraged to be fearful of that which is different. So those are just
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the positive side of that is, in this wide open field, which is America, we have the freedom to sample those different truths. The negative is that sometimes what we sample becomes what overwhelms us, and we get lost in it completely.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
I was going to add, Connor, to the rigor of faith is, to me, at least particularly the Mormons, how family life is so tight, and faith is practiced in the home. So it's not, so that's combining the community with the home system.
Our
So,
country
for better or
hungers
worse.
for that.
Pardon?
Our country hungers for that. There's such a need, and Mormons meet that need.
Yeah. You wonder what is the attraction, as any of these four representatives. Christian Science has never stood at the doors and
Mormons hate coffee. Don't go there.
That's right.
Yeah, Mormons are against anything that is, well, what is the word for cigarettes and coffee and alcohol?
Stimulants?
Stimulants, yeah.
Mm.
Okay, well, we've covered
Thank you.
a lot of ground.
Well done.